Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Politex, all things politics, all things Texas. We have a great show. It's a special edition segment on voting rights, and obviously that's been the center of our attention for a very, very long time. As we come to the end of the year in 2021, there is still a fight in Washington to bring us one standard when it comes to voting in this country, and that's an American standard. We're going to be hearing from some great guests. We're going to have Mike Sozan from the Center for American Progress. We're going to get into the details of the bill, what freedom to vote does, what the John Lewis Advancement Act does, and how it will impact our lives here in Texas. I think it'll be a great segment. And then we're going to talk to a couple of folks who've been really involved both in shaping the legislation and creating the organizing and engagement environment that we have seen across this country. I'm talking about Porsha White, who worked with End Citizens United, and with Jana Morgan, who was with an organization called the Declaration for American Democracy, DFAD. So we're gonna have a wonderful show. Thank you for supporting Politics. You can always follow us on social media. That is at TMFTX, on both Facebook and on Twitter. Again, thank you for supporting Politics. Everybody, we're back. Thank you for listening. Our next guest is somebody that I had the occasion to work very closely with his organization. They do a fantastic job. I'm sure you know who they are. I'm talking about Mike Sozan, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Mike, number one, thank you for being on this pod. And number two, thank you for all that you and everyone else at American Progress are doing for keeping some sanity in this country.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Tell you what, spending 6 weeks in Washington, D.C., it can be a lonely place if you don't have the right folks around you. And from day one, we were able to link up with some of your team at CAP, and from making appointments to just making things happen. I mean, I can tell you, very rarely can you spend a week in Washington and have the level of access that we had, and a lot of the access that we had was in part to your good work. So why don't you tell our listeners on the pod just a little bit about Center for American Progress and what you do for them?
Absolutely. And I want to say thank you to you as well, you and your colleagues, for your leadership, for your what I think are heroic actions, for leaving Texas and coming to DC and uprooting yourselves and being away from your families and your jobs for the many weeks that you were. You helped to really galvanize activity here in Washington, D.C., in Congress, and really focus their attention on the voting rights legislation and what was going on in Texas, but also really nationwide. And I think without that, we would not be in the position we are today, where we're close to the goal line for passage of voting rights legislation. What I'll say is a Center for American Progress, otherwise known as CAP, is a progressive think tank located in D.C. We're around 15 years old. We like to have an effect on the public debate and policy making. We're fighting for policies that are designed to help everyday people, common sense, progressive policies that are really aimed at making sure that everyone can achieve the American dream, and that we are a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic society. And frankly, fighting back against a lot of the really unfair, immoral policies that we occasionally or often saw from President Trump. So, and I happen to work on the democracy reform team, where we focused a lot on free and fair elections and how to uncorrupt our system, how to make sure that our government is working ethically and responsibly. And so that's what I focus day in, day out on.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for all that you do. And like I said, I mean, being able to work closely with CAP, I mean, we saw firsthand your reach, and we were able to really do a lot of things, particularly turning to these two pieces of federal legislation, which I know you've been tracking every single day. I want to talk a little bit about the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Advancement Act. And if you could tell our listeners just, and let's start with the Freedom to Vote Act, a little bit about what it does and why it would be so good. And keep in mind, in a state like Texas, there is very little flexibility that we have in this state to be able to vote. I mean, it is a voter suppression state. We keep saying this is not a Republican majority state. This is a non-voting state because it is so hard for people to vote. The tripwire is all on the ground. Tell us how freedom to vote would help people in Texas when it comes to being heard at the ballot box.
Gladly. And so the Freedom to Vote Act, it grew out of an act that many of your listeners probably know even better, which was For the People Act, which people have been fighting for several years, especially this year in Congress. And the Freedom to Vote Act is really a compromise bill that was co-led by Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. He got on board. It was important to get him on board, and he's tried to get Republicans to support it, but there are no Republicans who are going to support it. They filibustered it. What that bill does is it helps to set nationwide baseline minimum standards to protect the right to vote. It also would stop political gerrymandering, the unfair drawing of districts, which is what we're seeing in Texas right now. And it would help stop election sabotage. And at its root, what it would do it would overturn many of the worst of the state laws that have been passed over the many last months, including Texas. Texas's new law is one of the worst in the country. Texas already had limited the right to vote, and this new law that was jammed through by your Republican colleagues really takes voter suppression and voter sabotage to the next level. So the Freedom to Vote Act is the federal legislation that would override those bad state bills and protect the right to vote.
And so a couple of provisions that I'm familiar with is almost a no excuse absentee ballot. So if you wanted to vote by mail, so in Texas, you either have to be 65, you have to be disabled, and now you have to prove your disability, or you have to say that you will be out of the county for the duration of early vote. Other than that, you can't vote early. In this federal proposal, anybody can vote by mail, no excuses. Is that right?
That's correct. And there would not be this limitations on state and local election officials for how they send out requests for people to have their mail ballot, et cetera. So yes, that's exactly right. It opens up mail voting for anybody who wants it, and it does it in a responsible way that would not lead to any sort of widespread fraud. It also does things like allows for early voting for a 2-week stretch leading up to the election. It also would reverse the provisions in the new Texas law that said there can't be drop boxes for people to drop off their mail-in ballots. So that would be a requirement in the new law that people would have that option. And so there's a whole host of these.
And then a couple of other provisions. It also would establish a nationwide standard for voter ID. There's always this myth that Democrats are against voter ID. Democrats are not against voter ID. They just want an ID system that lives in the real world. And so under Freedom to Vote, you can use a Medicare card, a Medicaid card. What other types of IDs can you use to vote, if you know?
So for example, students could use their student ID. People can use, if for example, they've just recently moved and let's say they haven't gotten a new state ID or it's hard for them to do that, they can use a utility bill or something that has their address on it. And so there's a much broader array of IDs that can be used other than just a state issued driver's license, or I think in Texas now a gun license is what was allowed, but not student IDs.
So we do crazy things like this. We say you have to have an ID to vote, but don't worry, if you don't have an ID, you can get one for free. You just have to go to the DMV to get one. Well, in West Texas, for those voters there, it's a 200-mile round trip to go get this free ID. And listen, I don't miss elections, but if someone told me I needed to drive 200 miles in order to vote, I'd probably think about it. Exactly. And that's what leads to this voter suppression. What I also like about this federal proposal is it allows local governments, if they choose to send out applications for people to vote by mail. In Texas now, I believe that is now illegal, if not a crime. And so you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As my understanding of the Texas law is that it forbade local election officials or any election officials from doing that, and also criminalized it. So these officials who are trying to do the right thing and get access to people to vote. Our country was kind of founded on this principle of everyone should be able to vote. Well, actually, the country wasn't founded on it. We've actually had to make strides over the decades fighting so that everyone's voice can be heard, especially people of color. Now that we're finally getting closer to that, these are being this progress is being rolled back. So it was completely unfair to say that this sort of activity should be criminalized, that local election officials could be subject to criminal penalties. So that's another example of how the Freedom to Vote Act works. It would do away with that.
Let's do one more before we get into John Lewis. My favorite provision as the father of a 12-year-old and 11-year-old is that voters get to pre-register their right to vote at as early as the age of 16. That is the coolest thing in that 600-page proposal. How did that come about?
That came about because it's all about expanding the vote, right? So we want teenagers 16 and above who to be able to kind of feel like they're involved in the civic process, right? So some of these kids may have grown up going to vote with their parents, watching how their parents vote in the polling place, and this is a way of really getting them involved in the process to say, hey, you can sign up, you're going to get registered early. No, you cannot vote before you're 18. We're not changing that, but we're going to have you so that so that your name is on the voter rolls, you're ready to go. There won't be any kind of mistakes or problems with that when the time comes. So again, it's rooted in this idea of getting more people involved and proud of our democracy.
Right. Well, no, it's one of my favorites, and I was just really excited to see that make it in the proposal. I'm going to jump into the John Lewis Advancement Act, and you probably know this. Texas is sort of the poster child on voter discrimination. There's not a single decade since Texas was a covered jurisdiction. In other words, Texas had to pre-clear their changes in voting behavior either through the Justice Department or through a federal decision in Washington, D.C. in a courtroom. Every decade, there was an objection to anything Texas was doing when it came to redistricting. We became a covered jurisdiction in 1975 because of the work of the late Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. And one of the chief reasons for bringing Texas under federal preclearance was the English-only ballot. A lot of people don't know that the role that Latinos played in voting rights struggles in Texas, the English-only ballot was discriminated against a lot of Hispanics who could not read English, but yet were eligible to vote. And tell me about what John Lewis does to bring Section 5 into the modern era of our democracy.
Sure. So many of your viewers and listeners probably know that John Lewis was a civil rights icon and a long-time congressman. And there's this other major bill which is named for him, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is also awaiting Senate action, U.S. Senate action. There's been filibustered by the Republicans. It would really restore and strengthen the Foundational Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been severely weakened with a series of U.S. Supreme Court cases. The conservative majority has weakened it at least twice and taken out a lot of its force. And this is the Voting Rights Act was something that has long had a bipartisan enactment and reauthorization in Congress. And it's only in recent years that many members refuse to support it, namely Republicans refuse to support it. So this bill, which congressional Democrats are trying to pass, would, like I say, restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act. It does it in a number of ways, but one of the ways, as you said, is it revives the pre-clearance formula, which can get very complicated, but in essence, it revives it and says that states have to essentially prove that they do not have an intent to discriminate against people of color or anybody else, or that the actual effect of it will not be that way. And that way, when it has to be pre-cleared, that's what was done for years, as you said. It was done for decades, and that's how the federal law helped to make sure that states, especially southern states, were not trying to systematically exclude people of color from being able to vote. And it was only in more recent years when the Supreme Court struck down that pre-clearance formula that we've seen so many of these voter suppression laws spring up everywhere, including in Texas. So this would just modernize that pre-clearance section of the law and make sure that any of those changes going forward into the future would have to be pre-cleared. That would not help what, for example, the Texas law that's already in place. That's why we need the Freedom to Vote Act to do that. And we need this John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to look towards the future.
No, well, that's well said. And I know Section 5 is a little bit complicated, but in essence, for it originally for states in the South that discriminated against voters, principally African American, Latinos, whenever they made changes to voting, is if they were a covered jurisdiction, they had to pre-clear themselves with federal authorities. And then over time, it's expanded to other jurisdictions, municipalities, counties, other states. And what the Supreme Court said in its Shelby County decision was, well, we don't know if this discrimination is still as prevalent as it once was in the old days. So we need to modernize these formulas. And that is essentially what John Lewis has done. It has updated these formulas to give a sense across the country where there still are patterns and pockets of discrimination, patterns and practices of discrimination that would still require the need to pre-clear changes in voting standards. And so this was something that was never even debated before. This was a nothing burger. These would pass with unanimous votes and led by Republican presidents in some instances. But all of a sudden now this is toxic policy. The Republicans won't join us in passing.
That's exactly right. This used to be bipartisan. George W. Bush was president when he signed into law the last reauthorization. It passed the U.S. Senate 98-0, not one vote against that last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. It's been a proud tradition, foundational in this country, and now it's become, at least for one of the major political parties, something that they won't even touch.
Well, look, I appreciate it, and I want to get to one more question as we wrap up. And again, you're the Center for American Progress, so you are the font of knowledge when it comes to federal policy. And I want our listeners and viewers to get some inside baseball. What the hell is taking so long with getting this to the president's desk? Obviously, a majority in the U.S. House. We have President Biden, Vice President Harris eager to sign it, and of course, we have a Senate majority with Vice President Harris breaking the tie. Everybody pivots to say, well, it's just Manchin, it's Manchin, but it just can't be Manchin. Like what needs to happen so that we can get this across the finish line? I will remind you that the preamble to freedom to vote is very, very clear that this is going to apply to the 2022 elections. Well, here in Texas, we've already started filing for office a week ago. So the elections are before us. If we're going to have a new law, mañana's the busiest day of the week, man. We got to pass it today. So what's going on?
I agree with you, and it's it's a bit frustrating for a lot of people, including I'm sure a lot of your listeners and viewers, that the voting rights legislation has not passed yet. We've been working on it all year. You've helped to lead it, and with each passing day, it's tough because, as you said, so many states are already moving forward. The reason it's being held up is because of the Senate filibuster. So in the Senate, you basically need 60 votes to pass legislation, sadly. And the Republicans are refusing to lend even one vote, and it's a 50-50 Senate. So the filibuster is keeping it from moving forward. It's being blockaded. What the debate right now is what we call a family discussion within the Senate Democrats to try to get the last few holdouts, the Democratic senators, to agree to do some sort of filibuster reform, to allow a regular majority vote to occur to pass this incredibly needed voting rights legislation. The filibuster is not carved in stone. It's not in the Constitution. It's been changed many times. It's just a Senate rule, and it's an arcane Senate rule. We just don't have full 50-member support in the Senate Democratic caucus to reform it yet. I think we're getting close. I think the finish line is in sight. People need to make their voices heard. Please get in touch with your U.S. senators. I know that they're both Republicans. They need to hear. And I think within the next month, it could happen. The last thing I'll say is there's just a really crowded Senate agenda right now with a number of really important pieces of legislation. I think you would agree with me that there should be nothing that's more important than voting rights legislation. So we're just trying to all make our voices heard to be clear that this has got to stay near the front and center of the agenda. Every day that passes is not good, and this has to be passed within the next several weeks.
So what does this mean for you? We'll close with this. On November 14th, Senator Schumer, Leader Schumer, wrote a letter to his colleagues, and it's the gist of like what's going to happen before the end of the year. And he says, stay flexible, keep your work schedule. It could change. But when it came to the fight for free and fair elections, he said, because we know the Republicans have blocked this at every turn. He said, but just because Republicans will not join us doesn't mean Democrats should stop fighting. This is too important. Even if it means going at it alone, we will continue to fight for voting rights and work to find, quote, an alternative path forward, end quote, to defend the most fundamental liberty we have as citizens. What does that mean to you folks at CAP?
It means that he is very open to reforming the filibuster. He didn't use the F word there, filibuster, but that's essentially what he's saying, because the only last remaining option here is to reform the filibuster, because we're never going to get 10 Republican votes. That's the only way, therefore, to pass the voting rights legislation ultimately. So he is telegraphing to the world, really, because he knows that letter goes public, even though he sends it only to the senators. He's saying before Christmas break, we're going to be making a final push towards doing whatever we need to do to pass voting rights legislation, which really means reforming the filibuster.
Okay, well said. Well, listen, we'll leave it at that. Mike Sozan, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining this podcast. You have a platform here anytime you want to talk about policy. Say hello to John Podesta and the whole crew there at CAP. And, hopefully next time we see each other, let's drink a beer, okay?
I will. Hopefully we'll be celebrating. And again, thank you. Keep up your democracy crusading. We so appreciate it, and take care.
Thank you for listening. If you have a suggestion for the show or an idea for a potential episode, I value your feedback. Email your suggestions to contact@TreyMartinezFischer.com. As always, thank you for listening to Politics. Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm really excited to introduce our next guest. This is an organization that's been really on the front lines of the fights for lots of democracy issues, things that we all care about. Today, we're going to really spend some time talking about, federal voting rights reform in the Freedom to Vote Act, as well as the John Lewis Act. But my next guest, Porsha White, is the Vice President for Voting Rights and State Organizing for ECU, which stands for In Citizens United. We all know what that is. Porsha, thank you. Welcome to Politex.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listen, I know you're miles away, but we have a little Texas podcast here. We talk a lot of politics. We talk a lot of policy. I was fortunate enough to get to work with many of you at ECU during my 6 weeks stay and engagement in our nation's capital. Well, why don't you tell our audience just a little bit about In Citizens United and what you all do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am very lucky to work for In Citizens United and Let America Vote, which lead the fight really on getting rid of all this big dark money in politics and leading the fight on voting rights. So we get to kind of come at things from a dual angle, because we know that the same people who are putting all this dark money in our politics are the same people who are suppressing our right to vote. So we get to work on that issue every single day and help people to get the connection and to take action on that.
Wonderful. And but aside from, the fight for democracy is multifaceted, multi-layered. You fight in Washington, you also engage around the country. And, why don't you sort of, as we get to the end of 2021, give us a sense of how far has the clock turned back on democracy in individual states that you've been engaging in?
Well, it has been a year, to say the least. So I actually live in Georgia, so we got to see firsthand some of the rollbacks on voting rights that have happened since the 2020 elections. In many states, we have seen bills passed to restrict access to the ballot. We have seen states do things like Georgia, like prevent people from giving water to people in line. We have seen a decrease in access to people to be able to vote by mail. To people to use drop-in ballots to be able to vote whenever they are most convenient. We have seen a rollback in Texas of drive-through voting. and just anything that could really make it easier for people to vote. Meanwhile, on the federal level, we have been trying to get through the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would help put in some guardrails so that states cannot restrict access to the ballot as much, and can have some uniform standards to voting so that everybody across the state, no matter where you live, no matter what your zip code is, can have access.
And I recall a conversation with Representative Billy Mitchell, I believe. He's a Democratic leader there in Georgia.
He is.
Yeah, and he was just in awe to see all these Texas Democrats just leave Texas and go to Washington. And he said to me, I wish we could have done that. I wish we had those powers that we could have done that. We would have done it. And I told Billy, hey, listen, we had a warning sign because we saw what happened in Georgia. We saw a lawmaker get escorted away from the governor's office because they didn't want her to go to a bill signing ceremony. So we knew what was coming. And of course, my homegirl, Stacey Abram, we go back a long time, many years, and all the work that she's doing in the state of Georgia. But it just seems to me, particularly in the South, when you look at states like Texas, you look at Georgia, you look at what's happening in Florida, there seems to be just a targeted and determined effort to do a couple of things. Redraw lines through extreme gerrymandering based on race and hyperpartisanship. And then for those lines that they cannot redraw, they figure out ways to rewrite the rules, to reprogram how you vote. Because if you don't dot your I's and you don't cross your T, you're not going to be able to have your vote counted. Is that kind of what the theme is across this country?
Oh, absolutely. It's changing the goalpost, right? It's like Lucy with the football. Every time we get close to winning, they decide to change the rules on us and do something different. So glad you mentioned the redistricting efforts that are happening right now, because in states like Texas, where 95% of the new growth in the state has been with minority people, they have completely redrawn all of the lines to make sure that the voters' power will be diluted so that they will never see that sort of representation in the halls of Congress or in the halls of the state legislature.
And you're right. And so we know from our redistricting exercise 10 years ago, and just, for those not familiar with redistricting, it's the time of the decade where you redraw lines to account for adjustments to population in your states. And so we know in Texas, you couldn't just change any lines, especially if it impacted race. And we had some very strong provisions in both Section 2 and in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. But then the Supreme Court did a couple of things, right? Number one, it put Section 5 on hold and said Congress needs to come up with a new formula to determine what states have to follow Section 5. And then more importantly, the Supreme Court said in another opinion that it is not their position to judge partisan gerrymandering fights between politicians on parties. They're not going to intervene. So whoever's in charge, then Katie bar the door, you can draw these lines the way you want. And as a result, we're seeing these crazy scenarios where you could have a state like Texas that is growing by the day, tremendous minority growth, young, diverse population, zero accountability when it comes to members of Congress and state lawmakers. You do not see that growth reflected in the lines. You can say that in Georgia, you can say that in Florida, you can say that in Arizona, you can say that just about anywhere in the country where you have communities of color. They're growing the nation, but we see no political power to benefit that growth. Is that about right?
Oh, that's exactly right. Glad you mentioned my state of Georgia, that right now is going through the redistricting process and is a state that Biden won by 49.8%, but we are seeing a reduction in the number of Democrats who will have a seat in Congress, and they are splitting the state with all the state legislative maps as we speak.
And we're going to have another guest on who's going to really get into the weeds of freedom to vote. But I will tell you one part that really intrigues me in this conversation is I know that the law requires that if passed, all cases involving partisan gerrymandering can only be tried in one court in Washington, D.C., so that you couldn't just have politics run amok and come up with 50 answers in 50 different states. To me, that's the best way to sort of harness what's happening and really get a specialty court involved to look at these issues, to call balls and strikes when it comes to extreme partisan gerrymandering.
Exactly.
Wow. So also tell us, I mean, we're coming to an end of 2021, and I always get to say that sometimes when I show up late, I always tell people that I'm on Mexican time, right? There's always like 15 minutes late. We're getting to the end of the year. What's the forecast for passing John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or the John Lewis Advancements Act, and passing freedom to vote? How do you see it from your side of the table, and what kind of optimism, or more importantly, what kind of charge can you give to our listeners as we head into the end of the year?
Absolutely. So listen, we're going to get this bill passed. Yeah, I know that it's taking a little bit longer than we originally anticipated. And to be honest, I'm very frustrated with how long the Senate is taking to get these bills passed, but it's going to get done. Right now, Joe Manchin has been working to try to get more bipartisan support on the bill. And that is clearly not working. We have seen many votes at this point where Republicans have drawn their line in the sand and said they are not going to support any efforts on voting rights. So we're at the point where now we need to figure out how to get this bill done. Joe Manchin has said himself that inaction is not an option. So it's time to prove that. And if that means that we need to do some rules changes, then we need to look into that and get this thing passed, because Black and brown voters deserve a lot more than what's being presented to them on this with the state legislators rolling back voting rights.
So what we say oftentimes in the Texas legislature, particularly the Latinos, we always talk about mañana is the busiest day of the week, because we never get to it, right? We always say, we'll do it tomorrow, we'll do it tomorrow, and it just really just blows my mind to see the White House occupied by President Biden, the U.S. House and Speaker Pelosi, and we have a very slim, but yet we have a majority in the U.S. Senate, and we're just sort of, just moving like an iceberg, and it has to be frustrating. It's frustrating to me, and I sort of know the legislative process. I get the kabuki and how sometimes things take a while, but this is just really a little bit over the top. I mean, how do you feel about it?
I mean, again, I'm a Georgian, right? I am the one who didn't sleep last year during Christmas. We didn't get a Christmas holiday, right? Because we were working our butts off to deliver the Senate. Again, Georgia was the only red to blue flip in the House last year, and we voted for Biden. Like, I was one of the people who was working really, really hard to get this done. So it's extremely frustrating that after all the work we've done, we have seen very little action from specifically from the Senate. And we would, of course, love the White House's leadership a little bit more on this too, because they have a bully pulpit, and we hope that they are able to use it to do something as important as voting rights. We have made a lot of concessions for the filibuster in the past, including doing things like corporate tax breaks. So I think that voting rights is a little bit more important than that and should be a priority of this Congress.
Yeah, let's hope so. And now, we know now that the House has passed the Build Back Better and has sent that over to the Senate. And I imagine there's going to be a process to sort of look at that. And I guess the early speculation is there's not going to be a unanimity within the Senate, let alone the Democratic caucus. So I imagine there's some work to be done. But to me, it tells me that it also opens up some space to move forward on voting rights. And so do you see any other domestic policy issue getting in the way of voting rights now that Build Back Better seems to be on a path towards conference?
I'd hope not. I think that everybody at this point has seen what's happening in all of these states across the country and understand that voting rights has to be number one if we want any other issue and any other bill to get passed. We have to get through voting rights first. I'm not even thinking about like what this means in terms of election turnout. I mean, what the people of this country deserve. This has to be number one.
No, you're right. Listen, I'm inspired by the work that you all do. I'm very impressed when I had the opportunity to meet and work with Tiffany a little bit, and I've seen your reach on Capitol Hill. I've seen your reach across the country with stakeholders and organizations. But please tell the Politex audience, what can they do? I always tell folks when I make appearances, I tell them, hey, look, reach out to Senator Cruz and Cornyn, but don't hold your breath. But when you're done, send an email to Senator Klobuchar, send an email to Senator Padilla, send an email to John Sarbanes in the House, thank them for their work. What can folks in Texas do to stay engaged on this issue and help ECU get this across the finish line?
Yeah, while we're mentioning senators to think, let me throw out my own senator, Senator Warnock, who has been leading the fight on these bills as well. But after you're done contacting your members of Congress and your members of the state legislature who have more of a voice than you think, I would be talking to my family and friends about why this is important to our day-to-day lives. Elections are going to come up soon next year. And if people don't understand what is really at stake, then it really won't matter. So talking and doing like that grassroots organizing, that relational organizing at the table when you guys are together on any of these upcoming holidays, talk to your people and help them to understand why this is important and why they also need to make the phone call, even if it feels fruitless. It's still important.
You're right. We have to connect those dots. I mean, just, as we're going to be closing out, but let me, in redistricting, for instance, people get it when they realize their member of Congress just lost an Air Force base because someone thought they could take it. That's what happened here in San Antonio. Congressman Castro had Lackland Air Force Base taken out of his district for the worst reason, because Republicans could. 500 miles to the west in El Paso, Texas, Representative Veronica Escobar had Fort Bliss taken out of her district, and she's 5 minutes from the fort, but it was given to a Congress member, Republican, who lives 500 miles away. You couldn't do these things with an active Section 5. Section 5 would say, hold up, hold the line. What's this nefarious play going on here with regard to dislocating districts for the purposes of taking economic engines or strategic assets or where people live or where their district offices are. So you're right. We got to keep the momentum up. We got to keep talking, but we have to keep supporting groups like End Citizens United. Go ahead and give us your website or your social media feed so we know where we can find you. We want to get more information.
Yeah, absolutely. So our Twitter is at Stop Big Money and at Let America Vote, as well as our Instagram is at End Citizens United and at Let America Vote. And our website, you can look us up at endcitizensunited.org.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for making time to join our podcast. Porsha White, Vice President of Voting Rights and State Organizing for End Citizens United. Thank you so much for joining this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Hey, thank you, everybody. Welcome back. I'm here now with a friend of mine, someone that I had a chance to spend some time with while in Washington, D.C. for, I say a month, but my wife always reminds me it was not a month. It was almost 6 weeks. We're talking with Jana Morgan. She runs an organization called the Declaration for American Democracy. Been doing fantastic work in our nation's capital, rallying the country on voting rights. Jana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Trey. And I definitely appreciate being in working with you on these incredibly important issues. It's unfortunate the circumstances that have brought us together, but I am glad to be fighting this fight with you.
Yes, we've been doing it for a while. I mean, the last time we were together, as a matter of fact, you were handing out tank tops. It was dead middle of the summer, super hot. Now here you and I are both wearing sweaters. It's cold, and that just means we've been fighting this fight for a long time. So listen, this is a podcast. It's got a Texas audience, a little bit of a national audience, and we try to just really break down, current events and tell people what they need to know. So why don't you tell, our listeners and viewers about DFAD? What's it been doing these last, 6 to 9 months?
Absolutely. So the Declaration for American Democracy is a coalition of almost 250 organizations now representing millions of Americans that has come together because we believe that we need to transformationally change our democracy. And we started during the Trump administration because we believe that from times of great strife and corruption come times of great opportunity. And so we wanted to be ready to seize on that opportunity when it came. And that's why our coalition is so diverse. We have groups from racial justice sector, labor, climate, faith, business, women's rights, and a host of other different issue areas who have come together because they believe that we cannot make the progress we need on the issues that Americans care most about until we fix our democracy.
Well, let me tell you, you do a very good job. And I'll tell you, having spent, almost 6 weeks in Washington, D.C., we spent a lot of time on the Hill doing things the very old fashioned way, knocking on doors, making appointments. Had we only known, all we had to do was hang out with you. You have these rallies and you turn out not just, U.S. senators and members of the House, you turn out the principals who are actually working on voting rights. And so just tell us, how do you command such a stage where these folks are coming to talk to you about voting rights? Just what's the secret recipe to your success?
Well, I think it's that our partners are so engaged and they are so passionate about this work that's why principals are showing up to this work. That's why activists are showing up to this work. And people across the country continue to turn out. I mean, people are tired. We can definitely tell you that, but people are also fired up because we know that our democracy is literally crumbling around us, and that this is the moment where people in the future are going to look back and they're going to say either they laid it all out on the line and they did what needed to be done to secure American democracy, or this is the moment that America was knocked off course. And that's why we keep seeing members of Congress like Senator Klobuchar, Senator Merkley, Senator Warren, Senator Schumer, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, Representative Sarbanes. We have all of these wonderful members of Congress, Senator Warnock, Representative Davids, just so many people, Mondaire Jones, continuing to come out over and over for all of these events, and heads of major unions like the American Federation of Teachers. You've got Indivisible, Move On, Public Citizen, and Citizens United, so many different partners, Black Voters Matter, that continue to turn out. And I'm just so grateful to all of them and to the people at home who are turning out in the streets. We just had a week of action last week that had 80 events, or actually nearly 100 events all across the United States. It was our Time to Act, Freedom to Vote week of action. And people just keep turning out no matter how cold it gets.
I mean, it's amazing. And I will tell you, when I was there with you over the summer, you mentioned all these senators and members of Congress. There was also, Senator Padilla from California, Secretary of State, working on the compromise. You also, you mentioned Sarbanes, and it just so happened the day at the rally, he and I had a meeting later that afternoon, and the guy just hung out and said, "Hey, I tell you what, I'm going to wait for you. Just jump in my car. We'll go to the meeting afterwards." I mean, this is like really, really organizing at its finest. You've done a very good job. And with all of these principles, with all these partners, and everybody sort of, rattling, the cage and just, taking the hill by storm, just to answer the question for some of my constituents, what the hell's taking so long? Like, what are we facing? What obstacles are in the way in Washington that are preventing people from having justice and having one standard when it comes to voting in this country, and that's an American standard?
Absolutely. And, before I answer that, I'll just say before the pandemic started, I actually had the opportunity to travel to Maine, North Carolina, Colorado, Georgia, Arizona. And, I'm originally from New York and I live in Washington, D.C. So voting has always been relatively easy for me. And while I knew there was attempts to suppress the vote in other states, I didn't really truly understand until I got to talk to people in Georgia and I got to talk to people in Arizona. And that's something I think Americans across the country just don't get, is voting in Maine and voting in Colorado is a completely different experience than Texas, Georgia, Florida. And that's fundamentally wrong, because everyone deserves and is entitled to their right to vote. And the way things are right now, that's not the way it is. So I like that you said we need that one standard. We need that minimum standard for people to be able to vote.
When we met with Senator Manchin's, his chief of staff, his legislative director, we started comparing Texas voting rights law and West Virginia voting rights law. And you probably already know this, but in West Virginia, if you work a shift and you can't vote, you can vote by mail. If you live in West Virginia and you didn't want to go to the polls because folks weren't wearing masks, you could vote by mail. In West Virginia, if you just thought you were sick, you could request a mail ballot. If you were in the county jail on a DUI charge, you could get your ballot at the jail. You can't do any of that in Texas. And when folks in West Virginia understood just how high the hurdle is, I mean, it was like a mic dropping in the room. And frankly, I just said, hey, you know what? Forget the For the People Act, because that's what it was back then. Just give us the West Virginia law. In Texas, West Virginia law would move mountains and fight voter suppression. So you're right. We need one standard. Let me ask you this. I know you do these days of action and they're so effective, but tell our listeners and our viewers, you just had a rally at the White House recently. What happened at that rally?
Well, that's also in kind of in answering your previous question, which is like, what is the holdup? And one thing I'll just quickly say before I talk about that rally is that we've tried to have a vote on the Freedom to Vote Act 3 times. And Republicans in Congress, in the Senate, have 3 times used the filibuster to block it. And then we've seen with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore the Voting Rights Act, which has always been bipartisan, they just recently did the same thing again. So they're blocking even a debate on these critically important issues. And that's why we are calling on President Biden and Vice President Harris to use the full power of the White House, the full power of the bully pulpit of the Oval Office to do everything that they can to get these laws passed. Because in order to break that filibuster, we need them to be engaged. So I and 200 of my colleagues went to the White House yesterday, and we were arrested because we engaged in an act of civil disobedience. We refused to move away from the White House. It took, a couple of hours as everyone was arrested. And then we had about maybe 600 people in the crowd kind of just watching us. And so like all eyes are on the White House right now. And I like to say, I love Hamilton. So I like to say to President Biden, history has its eyes on you right now. And this is the moment where you have to decide, are you going to do everything you can to make sure that we can pass these critical bills?
Wow, that's very awesome. And just, for full disclosure, I was invited to be with you yesterday and I couldn't attend. And I will say, hanging out with you is dangerous business. And luckily, my wife, we met in Washington, D.C., and she reminds me that she still has her law license active in the District of Columbia. So maybe she, in case she had to get me out of jail one day, running around with DFAD, making good trouble. Jana, I appreciate it. We're gonna let you go, but in doing that, what can people do to get involved, whether it's with your organization or any one of the partners you work with? How can regular folks make their voices heard in this debate?
Absolutely. And I just want to call out also my colleagues, the League of Women Voters and People for the American Way, who really helped to put those actions on at the White House, and Black Voters Matter. They're fantastic organizations. Check them out, follow them. Same with Public Citizen. What I would say is, if you want to follow what we are doing, go to dfadcoalition.org or declarationforamericandemocracy.org. And we have a take action page that will allow you to call your member of Congress and demand that they move on voting rights. There's a call in line for the White House from Tuesdays to Thursdays. We want you to call that White House line and let them know you need them to act. You can write a letter to the editor, to your local newspaper. And I'll just say that we are going to be calling for Congress to delay their December recess until they pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So there will be actions you can take after Thanksgiving to that effect, including calls, including tweeting, social media actions, letters to the editor. There is nothing that is too small that you could do. But hearing directly from their constituents is one of the most powerful things that people can do. So while there may be opportunities to take to the streets or get arrested again, just make a phone call, write a letter to the editor. We give you a script. It's super simple. And that could move mountains for us in terms of making sure that they do not go on vacation until American democracy is safe.
Everybody, that concludes our show. I want to thank all of my special guests. Look forward to seeing you on our next segment of Politics. We are going to take a week off for Thanksgiving, so I hope you do too. We're going to eat some food, watch some football. Birds up, UTSA, Coach Trailer. Let's get it done in the 210. Enjoy your week, everybody, and we will see you once again on Politics.